The Awkward Truth presents Luke Masters Conference. The story of Father Adrian Kovac.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. Tonight, I'd like to discuss a man most of you have probably never heard of, Father Adrian Kovac. For the last 3 years, I've been cataloging a collection of photographs, audio recordings, letters, and reports allegedly connected to Kovac's work across Eastern Europe, Iraq and Ethiopia. Most of these documents are impossible to verify. Others are considerably more difficult to explain. At first, I assumed the reports from Ethiopia and Iraq were fabricated. Then I found references to the same incident in 3 unrelated archives. One aspect of Kovac's life that rarely appears in discussions of his work is his fascination with archaeology. According to friends, former colleagues, and several surviving letters, Kovac spent much of his free time reading about ancient civilizations. Mesopotamia, the Levant, ancient Egypt, the kingdoms of Assyria and Babylon. These subjects appear repeatedly throughout his personal notes. He was equally fascinated by the archaeological history of the Abrahamic faiths. Biblical sites, early Christian communities, forgotten monasteries, and the physical origins of religious traditions seem to have occupied his attention for decades. At first, this may seem like an unimportant detail. It is not, because by the late 70s, Kovac had become convinced that if he truly wanted to understand the roots of Christianity, he needed to leave Europe. He needed to go where many of these stories began. And so, against the advice of several members of his diocese, Adrian Kovac volunteered for missionary work in Iraq. Officially, his mission was pastoral. Unofficially, it appears he was searching for something else. Kovac appears to have adapted remarkably quickly to life in Mosul. His journals from this period contain surprisingly few complaints about the challenges one might expect from a foreign missionary arriving in northern Iraq. Instead, they are filled with observations about local customs, architecture, food, religious traditions, and conversations with the people he encountered. As a result, Kovac was granted access to a number of archaeological sites, historical monasteries, and religious locations that were largely unknown outside the region. Throughout his journals, references to these expeditions become increasingly frequent. What began as a personal interest in archaeology gradually evolved into a systematic effort to document the religious history of northern Mesopotamy. Many of the photographs presented in this archive originate from this period, and, as we will see, some of them raise questions that extend far beyond archaeology. As Kovac's travels expanded across northern Iraq, a new subject began appearing in his journals with increasing frequency: Mesopotamian demonology. At first, his notes are almost entirely academic. He references ancient Assyrian and Babylonian beliefs, protective spirits, apotropic figures, ritual tablets, and the complex religion and the supernatural in Siachalinchine. Several of the archaeological sites he visited contain fragments of statues and reliefs depicting beings that modern audiences might casually describe as demons. The reality, however, was far more complicated. Many of these figures were not considered evil in the modern sense. Some were guardians, others were punishers. Some were believed to carry disease, while others were invoked to prevent it. One figure appears repeatedly throughout Kovac's notes: Lamashtu. Lamashtu is a female entity associated with illness, misfortune, and the deaths of infants. Numerous amulets and ritual objects were created specifically to ward her off. What fascinated Kovac was not simply the existence of these figures, it was their persistence. Again and again, he encountered local traditions, stories, and beliefs that appeared to preserve fragments of concepts thousands of years older than Christianity itself. Initially, he treated these discoveries as archaeological curiosities. But over time, the language in his journals began to change. The statues were no longer described as artifacts. They became evidence Evidence of what, however, remained unclear. According to Kovac's journals, he never intended to become an exorcist. His first case appears to have been entirely accidental. In the spring of 1992, a local family from Mosul approached him seeking help for a 38-year-old man who had begun exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior. Relatives reported violent mood swings, extended periods of insomnia, episodes of paranoia, and moments in which he claimed to hear voices speaking from empty rooms. Kovac initially suspected a psychological condition and reportedly encouraged the family to seek medical assistance. The family asked if he could give the man from Mosul his blessing and say some prayers. That same day, he started recovering. This was not an isolated case, and naturally, people started looking for Kovac. Another priest, Father Samir Yako, an experienced exorcist, warned him not to play with fire. Yako worked with a local man who knew how to operate a camera and was willing to document his investigations in exchange for a little extra money. Mr. Yusuf Al-Najjar. At some point, Kovac approached Yako and asked to accompany them. Eventually, he requested something more unusual. He asked to become Yako's apprentice. By then, Yako was suffering from cirrhosis and had no one to inherit his knowledge. He was reluctant to pass his work on to a foreigner, but time was no longer on his side. With few alternatives remaining, he agreed. Over the following months, Yako introduced Kovac to a world that existed far beyond the boundaries of official religion. According to Kovac's journals, their conversations rarely focused on theology alone. Yako spoke of local traditions, ancient beliefs, sacred sites, protective rituals, and stories that had survived for centuries through oral tradition. He believed that northern Mesopotamia carried an unusually heavy spiritual burden. For thousands of years, armies, empires, treasure hunters, archaeologists, and looters had passed through the region. Temples had been destroyed, tombs opened, sacred objects removed, and entire sites stripped of their original purpose. To most historians, these events were simply part of history. To Yako, they were wounds. He believed that many of the disturbances reported throughout the region were connected to these acts. Families experiencing unexplained phenomena, individuals suffering from recurring nightmares, sudden personality changes, episodes of violence, and what local communities often described as spiritual oppression. Whether these accounts reflected psychological conditions, cultural beliefs, or something genuinely supernatural is impossible to determine. What is clear is that Yako viewed them as consequences. And over time, Kovac appears to have adopted the same perspective. Over the next several years, Kovac became one of Yako's closest collaborators. Together, they investigated nearly 20 cases across northern Iraq. Most involved individuals experiencing what local communities interpreted as spiritual affliction. Some were resolved quickly. Others remained unexplained. Throughout this period, Yusuf al-Najjar continued documenting their work, creating what would eventually become one of the most extensive visual records in the Kovac Archive. At some point, we believe in Ethiopia, days before his death, Kovac scratched many of the faces in the photographs. When Yako's health deteriorated and his involvement became increasingly limited, Kovac assumed a more active role. By then, he was no longer an apprentice. He was conducting investigations himself. With al-Najjar accompanying him, Kovac would go on to document more than 30 additional cases throughout Iraq and neighboring regions. Scary shit, right? Among the individuals Father Kovac is believed to have assisted during his years in Iraq were Ahmed al-Hadithi, Mahmoud al-Juburi, Hassan al-Tikriti, Karim al-Musuli, Salim al-Noami, Nabil al-Rawi, Jassim al-Hamdani, Yassim al-Hamdani, Faris al-Dulaimi, Tariq al-Ubaidi, Yahya al-Bayati, Samiya al-Khazraji, Khalid al-Azawi, Qazim al-Samari. At the same time, Kovac became increasingly involved in another responsibility of the mission. For decades, the church had quietly accumulated a collection of archaeological objects, manuscripts, photographs, and historical documents entrusted to its care by local communities. Some had been recovered from abandoned sites. Others had been donated by families seeking to preserve them. Many existed nowhere else. As conflict and instability spread throughout the region, these materials faced growing threats. Religious extremists viewed many of them as heretical relics that should be destroyed. Criminal networks saw them as valuable commodities destined for private collections abroad. According to the archive, Kovac spent countless hours cataloging, photographing, and organizing these materials. What had begun as a personal interest in archaeology gradually evolved into a mission to preserve fragments of history that might otherwise disappear forever. It was during these years that another obsession began to emerge in his journals: ancient Christianity. His writings reveal a particular interest in ancient churches, isolated monasteries, and traditions claiming descent from the earliest followers of Christ. Eventually, this interest led him toward Ethiopia. Officially, he traveled there to study ancient Christian sites. Unofficially, he appears to have been searching for something far older. Several entries reference persistent rumors concerning one of the lost tribes of Israel and communities said to have preserved traditions dating back thousands of years. In the late 1990s, Kovac and al-Najjar departed for Ethiopia. The most controversial chapter of the archive was about to begin. Kovac arrived in Ethiopia seeking history, ancient churches, remote monasteries, communities claiming traditions that stretched back centuries, perhaps even millennia. For a brief period, it seemed he had finally left exorcism behind. But, according to the archive, the pattern followed him. Within months of arriving, local clergy began contacting him regarding a series of unusual cases involving children from several villages in the region. Unlike the adults he had worked with in Iraq, these cases affected boys and girls, some barely old enough to speak. The reports disturbed him deeply. As the number of cases grew, so did his instability. His handwriting became erratic. Entire pages were crossed out. Several entries contain only fragments of sentences and repeated warnings. Then, without explanation, everything changed. According to Yusuf al-Najjar's testimony, Kovac became convinced that the archive itself should be destroyed. The photographs, the recordings, the journals, everything. One evening, following a heated argument, Kovac allegedly began gathering documents for disposal. Al-Najjar intervened. That same night, he removed a substantial portion of the archive from the mission and fled. It would be the last time he saw Kovac alive. Several days later, Father Adrian Kovac was found hanging inside his parish residence. Authorities ruled the death a suicide. Among his possessions was a short handwritten note. No explanation, no confession, only a final message. A message that remains one of the most disputed documents in the entire archive. Thank you very much, and have a good night.